Now let's create Falloff Effector to affect our copies to adjust their position as well as their P scale. Okay, and for that I'm using the copying setup that we have created in previous lecture. Okay, and let me copy this whole setup by selecting all of them, press and hold the Alt key and drag to duplicate this setup. And in here we need to create an attribute onto our these points, these scatter and align points. We need the attributes, the effector attributes onto these points. And first let me create a geometry that will affect our clones, and for that it could be any geometry. I am creating a torus. Let's add this and view this. Let's go into the torus parameter and let's adjust its radius. Maybe let's increase its first uniform scale. Let's adjust its inner radius. That is our inner radius. That's fine. Now let's add a mask from geometry node, mask from geometry, that will create a mask attribute for us. This node requires two inputs: the geometry for attributes, that is the geometry where I want the attributes, and that is the reference geometry, which is our torus. Let's view our mask from geometry node, and here we can see the guide. Let's bring up its parameter and it will output a mask attribute, and the attribute name is set to mask. Let's click on this button to visualize the mask attribute. Here as you can see, the mask attribute has been visualized in red. Okay, now let me connect this into my whole stream. Now let's use this mask attribute to control the position of our clones. I can add a transform node in here. Let's add this, and when the transform node is selected, hover over to the viewport, press enter. Now whenever I move my geometry around, here as you can see, I'm also moving my mask around as well, which is good. Now let's build our setup by adding a attribute warp node, attribute warp. Let's connect this, and I'm going to call this one affect position by adding affect pose, which means the position. And let's dive inside. Let's click on this mask from geometry and click on this to hide the visualizer of the mask. Let's dive inside the attribute warp node, and in here let's import this mask attribute. If I middle mouse button, here we have the mask, which is a float attribute. Let's import this. We can import this by adding a bind node, and onto the bind node let's type the name of the attribute that we want to import, that is called mask. And in here let's create a constant node in here, and this constant node will be used for adjusting the position. And because position is a vector, let's go into the constant and change this to 3 float vector. And I want to adjust the y value. I want to move these copies up, so let's change this one to 1. And now I can add a multiply node in here. Let's multiply this position value by the mask. Okay, and now I can add this 1 value into my original point positions by adding an add node. Let's add our original point position as well as these offset at position. Let me rearrange these nodes. Let's add this and connect this into our P, and here as you can see, the points has been lifted up, and we can control their position by adjusting this y parameter. Okay, and let's promote this parameter, and we can promote this by adding a parameter node in here. Let's add a parameter, and maybe let's disconnect this constant. First let me change this parameter, and I'm going to call this one offset. Let's rename this to offset, and the type should be the 3 float vectors. And let's connect this into our multiply, and let's remove the constant. And by using the parameter node, I can go back and onto the attribute warp. Here I have the offset. I can add the Y position to adjust the effect. Okay. And here onto the mask from geometry, let's go back. Here I can adjust the radius, as well as I can play around with the ramp parameter by adjusting the ramp to control my mask, as well as I can move my geometry around to affect my clones. Let's increase the number of copies by going to the scatter and align. Let's increase the total number of points, and maybe let's lower down. Let's not lower down, but completely disable these rotation as well as max cone angles. Okay, to better view what we are actually doing. Let's go into the mask from geometry. Let's play around with the ramp. Let me remove this knot as well. Okay, let's lower down the radius to create a more smooth fall off. Let's visualize the fall off of what we are doing. Okay, let's lower this term one down. I can really control my whole fall off effector. Okay, and now let's control the scale as well. And for that, I'm going to create another attribute warp node in here, and let's connect this. And I'm going to call this one effect scale. Effect scale. And now let's dive inside and let's build this setup once again. And first we need to import our mask. So let's add a bind node in here. Let's type the attribute name that is called the mask. And for this one, let's create another parameter node in here. And for this one, I'm going to call this one scale. And that should be a float parameter. P scale is a float value because it's a uniform scale. Now let's add a multiply node in here. Let's multiply the scale by the mask, and let's export this attribute as a P scale. Bind export, because P scale is an attribute that copy to point node understand for setting the attribute, for setting the scale. Let's rename this to P scale. Let's connect the output into our P scale as well. Let's go back and onto the effect scale. Let's enable the scale option. Okay, I can make the scale bigger by increasing the value more than 1. Okay, let's go back onto the mask. Here I can adjust the radius. I can actually make the effect in reverse by going onto the effect scale option and onto the scale, or into the after the multiply by adding a complement node. So let's add a complement and let's connect this. Now we have these values in reverse, or maybe let's reverse this one only. It's actually, we need to reverse this one. Okay, now let's go back. I can just play around with the mask to control my whole effect. Let's move around our geometry, effector geometry. Okay, I can input another geometry. For example, I can input a line in here, and let me view the line. Let's change the direction to X, zero out the Y. Let's increase its length, and now let's connect this into the mask from geometry node, and let's view our result once again. Okay, first let's see how we are generating our mask. Let's go into the mask and let's reset this radius parameter by pressing and holding the control and middle mouse button to reset, as well as control and middle mouse button onto the remap to reset our ramp. Let's increase the radius. Okay, and let me lift up this value, and let's lift down this value. Let's view the result again. Let's lower down the scale. Okay, let's also lower down the position. I can go on to the opposite direction, negative. Mask from geometry, lower down the radius, lower this one down to create another dip. Let's make another, adjust its ramp. Let's adjust its length, move around its origin, and maybe let's smooth out the overall effect, and we can smooth it out by adding an attribute blur node in here. Let's add an attribute blur, and let's blur out our mask. Let's tag on to the attribute. Let's blur out our mask attribute. Let's increase the blur iteration. Also increase the step size, and it's not working. Let's see. Mask from geometry, attribute blur. Influence type is set to connectivity, so it's looking for the connected points because all of these points are not connected. That's why it was not working. So let's change this to proximity. Now it should work. Let me lower down the blurring iteration. Okay, now let's view the result once more. Attribute blur. Let me increase the blurring iteration, and here, as you can see, we are blurring out our effect. We can lower down the step size, and we can increase the blurring iteration to really control our blur. Let's go back onto the effect position, adjust its Y position, and mask from geometry. Let's create another, play around with this a bit more. Okay, so that's how you can create the effector geometry. Okay,